They gave the order calmly, like it was routine. "Stand down. Hand over the dog." Atlas heard the command and froze. Then he stepped forward instead, not toward the men, toward Robert. His body locked into a battle stance, muscles tight, eyes burning with recognition. Every soldier there knew what it meant. This dog was choosing loyalty over orders, truth over authority. And in that moment, everyone realized the real danger was never the dog. It was the lie they were trying to bury. Winter settled heavily over Harbor Bay, Maine, the kind of cold that did not announce itself loudly, but pressed into the bones and stayed there. The harbor lay under a sheet of pale gray sky, the sea restless and dark, breathing mist into the narrow streets that ran alongside the docks. Snow had fallen the night before, not enough to soften the town, only enough to remind it how small and exposed it was against the Atlantic. In a place like this, the past had room to linger. Robert Hale had chosen Harbor Bay because it asked nothing of him. At 62, he lived with the quiet discipline of a man who had already given most of his life to noise, danger, and command. He was tall, though age had drawn his shoulders slightly inward, not from weakness but from habit, as if he had learned long ago to make himself smaller when necessary. His hair was silver gray, cropped short in a style that had not changed since his service days. His face was deeply lined, weathered by salt air now, but once shaped by sun and sand in places far from Maine. His eyes were pale blue, steady and observant, the eyes of someone who had learned that survival often depended on noticing what others overlooked. Robert was a former Navy SEAL, long retired, though nothing about him suggested the word former. He did not speak of his service. He did not correct people when they assumed he had been a fisherman or a dock worker. He had walked away from the life that defined him once, and he had done so completely. Or so he believed. His house stood near the edge of town, a small, weather-beaten structure facing the harbor. It was rented, sparsely furnished, and deliberately impersonal. No photographs, no trophies, no reminders. Robert believed that if you kept the past close, it had a way of demanding things from you. He was done with demands. Each morning he walked. The routine was simple and precise. He left his house just after dawn, his breath visible in the air, his boots crunching softly against snow-dusted pavement. He wore the same olive-green jacket every day, the fabric worn thin at the elbows, the pockets deep enough to carry gloves and habit. Beneath it, a plain sweater, dark trousers, sturdy boots that had seen better years but still held together. Nothing about his appearance invited conversation. The harbor was quiet at that hour. Fishing boats rocked gently against the docks, ropes groaning in slow complaint. The smell of salt, diesel, and cold metal hung in the air. Robert moved along the pier with measured steps, his hands relaxed at his sides, his posture calm. To anyone watching, he looked like an old man taking a walk. To himself, it was something closer to a patrol, though he no longer named it that. People in Harbor Bay knew Robert only in fragments. The mail carrier, a young man named Luke, thought he was polite but distant. The woman at the small grocery store noticed he always paid in cash and never lingered. No one knew where he had come from before Harbor Bay, and no one asked. That was part of the town's unspoken agreement with itself. Robert preferred it that way. That morning, the cold seemed sharper than usual. The wind cut across the pier, carrying fine grains of ice that stung the skin. Robert slowed near the end of the dock, looking out toward the gray horizon where sea and sky blurred together. He exhaled slowly, grounding himself in the moment. Then he heard it. Not footsteps, not the scrape of boots or the shuffle of someone else moving through the cold. It was a sound lower than that, deeper, a controlled exhale that carried intention. Robert froze, the way he had been trained to do decades ago before thought could interfere. He turned his head slightly. At the far edge of the dock, partially obscured by a stack of old crates and drifting mist, stood a dog. A German shepherd. The animal was large, powerfully built, with a thick coat of dark fur that blended easily into the winter shadows. His stance was balanced and deliberate, weight evenly distributed, head level rather than lowered. His ears were upright, alert, catching every sound. One front leg rested just a fraction differently than the other, hinting at an old injury rather than a fresh one. His muzzle showed signs of age, gray threading through black. The dog did not bark. He did not growl. He simply watched. Robert felt something tighten in his chest, an involuntary reaction that caught him off guard. He had not felt that sensation in years, not since he had stopped expecting the world to surprise him. His eyes met the dog's, and for a brief moment, the harbor, the cold, and the quiet town fell away. The look in the dog's eyes was not the look of a stray. It was focused, assessing, calm in a way that came not from comfort, but from experience. Robert stayed still. He knew better than to approach an unfamiliar dog, especially one built like this. "Easy," he said quietly, the word slipping out before he could stop it. His voice was low, even, carrying a cadence he had not used intentionally in a long time. The dog's ears twitched. That was all. No sign of fear, no sign of submission, just acknowledgement. Robert took a slow breath. He shifted his weight slightly, testing the moment. The dog did not react aggressively. He adjusted his stance, mirroring the movement with subtle precision. Robert's stomach tightened again, this time with recognition rather than surprise. He had seen this before. Not here, not now, but somewhere else, in another life. Robert turned and continued walking, telling himself the dog would lose interest. Harbor Bay had its share of strays. Animals followed people all the time, especially in winter. The sound followed him, measured, unhurried. When Robert glanced back, the dog stood several yards behind him, maintaining distance, moving only when Robert moved. Not chasing, not trailing aimlessly. Following. The words settled uncomfortably in Robert's mind. As they reached the edge of the pier and turned toward town, the dog remained with him. A fisherman passed them, a broad-shouldered man wrapped in layers, his face red from the cold. He nodded at Robert without comment, barely sparing the dog a glance. The animal did not react, only watched the man pass and then returned his attention to Robert. That, more than anything else, unsettled him. Strays reacted. They flinched or lunged or begged. This dog conserved energy, chose focus. Robert stopped near a row of closed shops, the windows dark and rimmed with frost. He turned fully toward the animal now. Up close, the details became impossible to ignore. Scars, faint but deliberate, traced the dog's chest and shoulder, the kind left by shrapnel or impact, not by accident or neglect. His breathing was steady. His eyes, dark and intelligent, searched Robert's face as if looking for confirmation. Robert swallowed hard. For an instant, a smell rose unbidden in his memory. Heat, smoke, the metallic tang of explosives, the distant echo of orders shouted over chaos. He felt the ghost weight of gear on his shoulders, the pull of responsibility, the unspoken trust between man and animal in places where hesitation meant death. He stepped back as if struck. The dog did not advance. He sat down instead, controlled and deliberate, tail still, posture proud, even in rest. "Go on," Robert said softly, though there was no force behind the words. The dog did not move. Snow drifted between them, silent and slow. Robert felt something he had worked very hard to bury begin to stir. Not fear, not regret. Recognition. He turned away again and walked the final block to his house, every step heavier than the last. The dog followed, stopping only when Robert stopped, closing the distance gradually but never crowding him. When Robert reached his door, he hesitated with his hand on the knob. He turned. The German shepherd stood on the walkway, close enough now that Robert could hear his breathing clearly, see the age in his eyes, the wear of years that matched his own. "What are you doing here?" Robert asked quietly. The dog held his gaze. Robert Hale shut the door behind him and locked it out of habit, not fear. The German shepherd stood just inside the room, motionless, body angled slightly inward, head level, ears alert. He had entered without hesitation, but stopped short of assuming permission, pausing as if waiting for a command that never came. Robert noticed immediately. No pacing, no sniffing, no curiosity-driven movement, just control. The house was small and quiet. Robert moved through it with practiced efficiency, setting his jacket down, placing his boots by the wall. The dog tracked every movement with his eyes, calculating distance and position without shifting his weight. Robert felt the tension rise in his chest, sharp and familiar. This was not the presence of an animal adjusting to a new space. This was a sentry selecting a post. Robert turned fully toward him. Up close, there was no room for denial. The dog was older, the sharp edges of youth worn smooth by time and use, but the structure remained unmistakable. Broad chest, thick shoulders, musculature built for endurance, not speed. His coat had dulled, and gray lined his muzzle. One front leg rested slightly off balance, the trace of an old injury that had healed but never fully disappeared. Scars cut through the fur on his chest and shoulder, faint but clean. Treated injuries, not accidents. Robert exhaled through his nose. "This isn't happening," he muttered, but his voice lacked conviction. He lowered himself into the chair at the kitchen table. Age slowed him, but it had not made him uncertain. The dog adjusted his position, shifting to the wall opposite the door, sitting with his back protected, his body aligned parallel to Robert's. The posture was precise, intentional, defensive without being aggressive. Textbook. Robert closed his eyes briefly. He had seen this stance in other places, other rooms under conditions far less forgiving than this quiet house. He had spent years convincing himself that those memories were no longer relevant. He opened his eyes again. The dog's gaze hadn't wavered. "Atlas," Robert said quietly, the name escaping before he could stop it. The reaction was instant. The dog's ears snapped forward, sharp and clean, then settled again. No confusion, no hesitation. Robert froze. That response wasn't training alone. It was recognition. His heart began to pound, not from fear, but from the weight of certainty pressing down on him. Atlas had been his partner, not one of many, not interchangeable. Assigned to him, trained with him, bled beside him. They had moved through hostile ground together, trusting each other more than orders, more than equipment. Robert leaned forward, elbows on the table, his hands clasped tightly. "I watched you disappear," he said, low and rough. "I asked, I pushed, and they told me you were gone." Atlas remained still, but his eyes softened, just enough for Robert to notice. A sound outside pulled Atlas's attention instantly. Footsteps on the porch, familiar ones. Robert recognized the pattern before the knock. Sarah Whitman knocked twice and waited. She stood just inside the doorway when Robert opened it, tall and slender, her dark hair pulled back, her coat still dusted with snow from earlier. Sarah carried herself with a quiet restraint shaped by loss, her kindness measured rather than careless. Her eyes went immediately to Atlas. "You weren't exaggerating," she said softly. Atlas shifted his gaze to her, assessed, then returned his focus to Robert. No tension, no interest beyond evaluation. Sarah noticed. "He's not acting like a dog who wandered in off the street." "No," Robert said. "He's not." She stepped inside slowly, careful with her movements. Atlas adjusted his position just enough to keep Robert within his peripheral vision. Sarah's brows knit slightly. "He's guarding you," she said. Robert didn't answer. Sarah straightened, understanding without needing explanation. "I won't stay," she said quietly. "Just don't ignore what this means." When she left, the silence closed in again. Robert stood and crossed to the counter, retrieving a small piece of dried meat from the cupboard. He held it out in his open palm. Atlas didn't move. Robert waited. Seconds stretched. Years ago, impatience could get you killed. He hadn't forgotten that lesson. "Atlas?" he said again. The dog's gaze sharpened. "Sit!" Atlas was already sitting. Robert's jaw tightened. He raised 2 fingers slightly, the gesture small enough to be missed by anyone else. It was an old signal, one they had used when sound meant exposure. Atlas responded immediately, closing the distance by a precise margin, aligning himself closer to Robert's leg. Robert's breath hitched. That wasn't obedience. That was memory layered over discipline. "Guard," Robert whispered. Atlas repositioned instantly, stepping forward and angling his body to shield Robert without restricting his movement. His muscles tensed, ready but restrained. Protective, controlled. The room seemed to tilt. Robert's mind filled with flashes. Heat, sand, the metallic tang of explosives. Atlas younger, moving ahead of him, pausing at the edge of danger, glancing back once for confirmation. The trust between them had never needed words. Robert lowered his hand, his fingers trembling. "They said you were reassigned," he said quietly. "Like you were a piece of gear." Atlas stepped closer and rested his head briefly against Robert's knee. The contact was light and deliberate, not affection, acknowledgement. Robert closed his eyes. For years he had believed walking away was survival, leaving the uniform, leaving the system, leaving the ghosts. But some bonds were not erased by time or distance. They waited, patient as soldiers trained to hold position. Atlas settled beside him, choosing the spot without instruction, his body close enough to feel solid and real. Robert rested his hand on the dog's neck, firm and steady. "I never forgot you," he said. Atlas stayed. And in that quiet room, the truth became undeniable. This was no chance meeting, no wandering animal. This was a soldier who had found his way back to the only man who had ever been his partner. The fog returned to Harbor Bay before noon, rolling in low from the water and flattening sound as it spread through the narrow streets. The cold remained sharp, but it was the quiet that unsettled Robert Hale most, the kind that arrived before something changed. From the front window of his small house near the harbor, he watched the street without appearing to. Old habits lingered. He had learned long ago that trouble rarely announced itself loudly. Atlas lay beside the table, body aligned with Robert's chair, head up, ears relaxed, but ready. Since the moment of recognition earlier that morning, the German shepherd had not left Robert's side. He did not crowd him. He did not demand attention. He simply stayed close enough to matter. The dog's age showed in the faint stiffness of his movements, the silver along his muzzle, but the discipline remained intact. He still moved like a working animal, not a pet. Robert had spent the last hour saying little, doing less. He knew better than to rush clarity. Atlas's presence had already pulled open doors in his mind that he had kept locked for years. He was not ready to face what lay beyond them. Not yet. The sound of engines broke the quiet, not the usual trucks or fishing vans that passed through town. These engines were synchronized, controlled, stopping almost at the same moment. Atlas's head lifted instantly. His ears snapped forward, not in panic, but alert focus. He rose in one smooth motion and moved to the window, stopping just short of it. His breathing slowed, deep and measured. Robert followed his gaze. 2 dark SUVs sat at the far end of the street, matte paint absorbing the gray light. No markings, no local plates. The doors opened with quiet precision, and 4 men stepped out. They moved with purpose, spacing themselves naturally without speaking, their posture upright, their movements efficient. Even beneath heavy jackets, Robert could see it. The stance, the balance. the way their heads turned in controlled arcs rather than quick glances. Navy SEALs. Robert felt a familiar tension settle into his shoulders. Not fear, recognition. The men approached the house in a staggered line, not aggressive, but deliberate. The one in front was tall and broad-shouldered, likely in his early 40s, with close-cropped blonde hair and a jaw set permanently tight. His eyes were sharp, scanning the street even as he walked. He carried himself like someone used to being obeyed, not because he demanded it, but because it was expected. Behind him walked a younger man, late 20s perhaps, leaner, dark-haired, his movements precise but his expression less certain. He watched his surroundings carefully, but his gaze lingered on details longer than necessary, as if weighing them. The third man was older, thick-necked, with a graying beard and hands that never strayed far from his jacket pockets. The fourth remained closer to the vehicles, maintaining distance, eyes on the perimeter. Atlas growled softly. Not loud, not threatening, a low vibration that never rose in pitch. "Easy," Robert murmured, though his own pulse had quickened. The knock came firm and controlled. Robert opened the door before it came again. The lead man offered a tight, professional smile. "Robert Hale," he said, voice level. "Mind if we talk?" Up close, Robert took in the details. The man's jacket was civilian, but worn in a way that suggested it had been chosen for function rather than comfort. His boots were clean, military-issued, not local. His eyes flicked briefly past Robert, registering Atlas's position in the room in less than a second. "Depends," Robert said. "About what?" The man's gaze returned to Robert's face. "We're here about the dog." Atlas stepped forward half a pace, placing himself just ahead of Robert's knee. The movement was subtle but unmistakable. The younger SEAL noticed immediately. His eyes widened slightly before he masked the reaction. The lead man nodded once. "That's him," he said. "Atlas." Robert's jaw tightened. "You know his name," he said. "We do," the man replied. "May we come in?" Robert hesitated, then stepped aside. The men entered with measured caution, spacing themselves naturally. The bearded SEAL took a position near the door. The younger one stood near the wall, his posture attentive but restrained. The lead man faced Robert directly. "My name is Commander Ethan Cross," he said. "We're an internal recovery unit. We're here to retrieve that animal." Atlas's ears flattened slightly. His body tensed, but he did not advance. "Retrieve," Robert repeated. "From me?" Cross nodded. "Atlas is considered Navy property. He went missing during a reassignment process. His current status is irregular." The word sat wrong. "Irregular how?" Robert asked. Cross's expression didn't change. "He failed to respond to handlers, demonstrated disobedient behavior. He left a secure facility without authorization." "He escaped," the younger SEAL said quietly, then stopped himself. Cross shot him a look. Robert noticed. "And now?" Robert asked. "And now he needs to be returned," Cross said. "For evaluation." Robert studied the man's face. There was confidence there, authority, but also impatience, the kind that came from wanting a situation resolved quickly, cleanly. Atlas shifted his weight, positioning himself more squarely between Robert and Cross. Cross's gaze dropped briefly to the dog. "He's trained to protect," he said. "That's not unusual, but his behavior has become unpredictable." Robert shook his head slowly. "No, it hasn't." Cross raised an eyebrow. "You're saying you know better than our assessments?" "I'm saying I know this dog," Robert replied, "and I know when someone's lying about him." The room went still. The bearded SEAL adjusted his stance slightly. The younger one swallowed. Cross's smile thinned. "Careful, Mr. Hale." Robert didn't flinch. "Careful with what?" "With accusations," Cross said. Atlas deserted his post. That alone is enough to warrant retrieval. Dogs don't desert, Robert said evenly. They're reassigned, removed, or abandoned. The younger seal looked down. Atlas let out another low growl, deeper this time, his eyes locked on Cross. Not fear, not rage. Recognition layered with warning. Cross noticed. His jaw tightened. This is exactly the kind of instability we're talking about. Robert felt it then, not certainty but suspicion. The way Cross spoke about Atlas as a problem to be contained rather than a soldier to be understood. The way the others deferred without enthusiasm. The way the word evaluation hovered, undefined. "What happens to him after you take him?" Robert asked. Cross met his gaze. "That's classified." Robert's suspicion hardened. "I won't hand him over," he said. Silence followed. Cross's voice dropped slightly. "This doesn't have to be difficult." "It already is," Robert replied. Atlas remained steady, muscles coiled, eyes clear. Orders without honor, Robert thought. He had seen them before, given them once, regretted them ever since. And for the first time since Atlas had reappeared, Robert understood something clearly. Whatever these men wanted, it had nothing to do with the dog's well-being. "Secure the animal." Commander Ethan Cross did not raise his voice. He didn't need to. He was tall, broad-shouldered, early 40s, with close-cropped blonde hair and a face that looked permanently carved from command. His tone was flat, practiced, the kind that assumed the world moved when he spoke. Atlas moved first, not a bark, not a charge. One sharp step forward, clean, precise. He placed himself squarely between Robert Hale and the men, shoulders set, paws spread just enough to anchor his weight. Head level, eyes locked. The stance was unmistakable to anyone who had ever worked with a military K-9. Defensive hold, shield posture, no escalation. Robert felt the shift beside him like pressure against his ribs. "Atlas," he said quietly. The German shepherd did not retreat. He didn't need reassurance. He needed confirmation. Robert raised his open hand slightly, palm out, steady. Atlas held the line. The younger seal froze. He was late 20s, lean, dark-haired, with the kind of face that hadn't fully learned how to hide thought yet. His boots stopped mid-step. His eyes flicked to Atlas's paws, then to his shoulders, then to his jaw. He knew what he was looking at. "Sir," he said under his breath. "He's not charging." Cross didn't look at him. "I didn't order commentary." The bearded seal adjusted his stance near the door, thick neck flexing, hands open, but ready. Older than the rest. Smarter, too. He'd seen situations like this slide sideways before. He watched Atlas carefully, not like an enemy, but like a variable. Atlas's growl rolled low and steady, barely audible, but impossible to ignore. Not anger. Warning. Cross took a step forward. Atlas didn't move. He widened his base by inches and lowered his center of gravity. The line was set. "Mr. Hale," Cross said, voice cool, "you are interfering with a lawful recovery. Order the dog to move." Robert didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. "He's not my dog." Cross's eyes narrowed. "Then you won't mind stepping aside." Robert shook his head once. "He's my partner." The word landed hard. The younger seal swallowed. His jaw tightened. "Sir," he said again, louder this time. "That posture is controlled. He's executing training." Cross turned sharply. "Are you questioning my authority?" "I'm questioning the rid," the younger man replied. "If he were unstable, we'd already be bleeding." Silence snapped tight across the room. Atlas's eyes never left Cross. He wasn't reacting to the men behind him. He was tracking intent. Cross felt it. He stopped advancing. A soft voice cut in from the hallway. "Stop." Sarah Whitman stood there, tall and slim, dark hair pulled back, her posture rigid with restrained fear and anger. Loss had taught her when to stay quiet. It had also taught her when silence became permission. She took in the scene in a second. The men, the tension, the dog's stance. "That animal isn't attacking anyone," she said. Cross ignored her. Robert felt something cold settle in his chest. He had heard this tone before. Orders delivered without space for truth. He had followed them once. He would not again. "Atlas," he said softly, not as a command, but a bond. Atlas's ears flicked back for half a second. Acknowledgement. He stayed put. The bearded seal edged forward a fraction, testing. Atlas responded instantly, growl deepening, shoulders tightening. Not a threat, a promise. The younger seal lifted his hand slightly. "Sir," he said, firm now. "One more step, and this turns into something we can't explain away." Cross stared at Atlas, jaw clenched. He wasn't afraid, but he was calculating. The dog wasn't bluffing, and Cross knew it. Sarah moved closer to Robert, voice steady. "You're not taking him." Cross finally looked at her. "This doesn't concern you." "It does," she shot back. "You walked into his house and pointed a weapon with a badge." Atlas didn't react. He didn't need to. Robert felt clarity cut through the noise. This was the line. The one he'd crossed before. The one that cost him years of sleep and a partner he thought he'd lost forever. "I won't cross this one," Robert said. Cross held his gaze. The seconds stretched. Atlas's eyes tracked Cross's hands, micro-movements mapped and measured. One wrong twitch would trigger muscle memory written into bone. Cross stepped back. The room exhaled. "This isn't over," Cross said. "That dog belongs to us." Robert nodded once. "Not today?" Cross turned sharply. The bearded seal followed without comment. The younger one hesitated, eyes flicking to Atlas, then to Robert. Respect. Doubt. He turned and left, the door shut. Atlas stayed in position for several seconds longer, listening, confirming retreat. Then he stepped back and sat beside Robert, posture proud, breathing steady. Robert rested his hand on Atlas's neck, firm, grounding. "Good," he said. Atlas leaned into the touch once, just once. Sarah let out a shaky breath. "That wasn't about obedience," she said. "No," Robert replied. "It never is." He looked down at Atlas and knew with absolute certainty that whatever came next, he would hold this line. Some orders weren't worth following, and some bonds were worth standing your ground for. Atlas did not relax after the men left. He remained close to Robert, posture steady, eyes alert, listening to sounds beyond the walls, as if the house were no longer a shelter, but a temporary position. Robert noticed the change immediately. The dog was no longer guarding against an immediate threat. He was tracking something else, something unfinished. Robert put on his jacket without speaking. Atlas rose at once and fell into step beside him, matching pace without instruction. The bond did not need words. It moved on habit and memory. When they stepped outside, the harbor lay ahead in muted gray tones, cranes and masts standing like skeletal sentinels. The air carried the metallic tang of salt and old fuel. Robert had walked these docks for weeks, yet now they felt unfamiliar, charged with a presence he could not name. Atlas halted abruptly near the corner of the street. His ears snapped forward. His body stiffened. He turned his head toward the harbor and released a low, insistent sound that vibrated through his chest. Not a growl meant to warn people away. This was focus sharpened into urgency. "You hear something," Robert murmured. Atlas moved. He led with purpose, not pulling, not rushing, just enough speed to make his intent clear. Robert followed, boots crunching softly over gravel and frost. As they neared the water, Atlas slowed, nostrils flaring. His tail remained still. His eyes scanned the dockside buildings with precision. The old warehouse sat at the far end of the pier, a long, weather-beaten structure with rusted doors and boarded windows. It had once stored fishing equipment and spare engines. Now it stood officially unused, waiting for paperwork that never seemed to arrive. Robert had passed it dozens of times without a second glance. Atlas stopped 20 yards short of the entrance. He lowered his head and sniffed the air again, then shifted sideways, pacing a short line back and forth. His breathing changed. Faster. Sharper. His muscles tightened under his coat. The reaction was immediate and unmistakable. Explosives. Robert felt the word land in his mind before he consciously formed it. He knew the signs. He had watched Atlas react like this before, years ago, in places where one wrong step meant no next step at all. "Easy," Robert said softly. Atlas did not advance. He did not retreat. He held his position and looked back at Robert, eyes bright with intensity, waiting. Confirmation. Robert scanned the area. No guards, no posted warnings. Just the quiet hum of the harbor and the distant slap of water against pylons. He took a careful step forward. Atlas snapped his head toward him and let out a sharp bark. One note. Controlled. "Stop." Robert froze. "That close," he said quietly. Atlas eased his stance but did not move. His message was clear. There was danger here, close enough to matter, but not yet visible. Robert stepped back to where Atlas stood and crouched beside him, running his hand briefly along the dog's shoulder. The muscle beneath his palm quivered with restrained energy. A memory surfaced, sharp and unwelcome. Sand. Heat. The same posture. Atlas stopping him with that same single bark, an order without words. Robert remembered freezing then, too, heart hammering just before a controlled detonation cleared a path that would have killed 3 men if they had advanced another step. His throat tightened. "Same tell," he whispered. Atlas held his gaze. Robert stood slowly and backed away from the warehouse entrance. He did not need proof yet. He needed context. Atlas had not reacted like this anywhere else in Harbor Bay. Only here. They circled wide, keeping distance, moving along the edge of the pier. Atlas's attention never wavered. Each step brought small adjustments in posture and breathing, the signs of a working dog mapping invisible lines. Robert watched, cataloging everything. A voice called out behind them. "Robert?" Sarah Whitman stood several yards away, wrapped in her coat, hands tucked into her pockets. She had followed at a distance, concern outweighing caution. Her face showed the strain of the morning, the lines around her eyes deeper when she frowned. She was used to watching storms form before others noticed the change in wind. "What's going on?" she asked. Robert did not answer immediately. He watched Atlas, who had turned his head just enough to register her presence before returning his focus to the warehouse. "Something's wrong here," Robert said finally. Sarah glanced toward the building. "That place?" she asked. "It's been empty for years." Atlas barked once, short and sharp. Sarah flinched. "He doesn't like it." "No," Robert said. "He recognizes it?" Sarah studied the dog more closely now. His age showed in the silver along his muzzle, but his eyes were alive with purpose. "He's not afraid," she said. "He's certain." Robert nodded. They moved farther down the pier, giving the warehouse a wide berth. Atlas's tension eased slightly once distance grew, but he kept glancing back, as if anchoring the location in his mind. Robert felt the pieces beginning to shift inside him, old thoughts resurfacing with uncomfortable clarity. The mission. It had been logged as routine support. Harbor infrastructure survey. No engagement expected. Atlas had alerted early then too, long before sensors picked up anything abnormal. Robert had reported it. The report had been amended later, softened, details removed. He had questioned it once, then been told to stand down. He had been injured days later in an unrelated incident. Atlas had been reassigned. The memory sharpened, no longer fragmented. "That warehouse wasn't on the original map," Robert said quietly. Sarah looked at him. "What?" Robert shook his head. "Nothing." But Atlas heard the tension in his voice. He stepped closer, pressing his shoulder briefly against Robert's leg, grounding him. They walked back toward town as the harbor resumed its muted rhythm. Robert's mind worked quickly now, connections forming whether he wanted them to or not. Atlas had not gone missing by accident. He had been removed from something inconvenient, something that had never been fully reported. As they neared the edge of the pier, Atlas stopped again and turned, staring back toward the warehouse. He lifted his nose and inhaled deeply, then released a low sound, almost a whine, threaded with frustration. "I know," Robert said. He knelt in front of the dog, meeting his eyes. "You tried to warn them," he said quietly. "Didn't you?" Atlas's ears flicked. His gaze held steady. Robert felt the weight of it settle fully now. Whatever was hidden in that warehouse, it had roots that stretched back years. And Atlas had been part of the reason it stayed hidden. He had been silenced, not because he was unstable, but because he was right. Sarah watched them, unease spreading across her features. "You're thinking about going back there," she said. "Not yet," Robert replied. "But I won't ignore it." The harbor stayed restless long after the vehicles from earlier had disappeared, engines in the distance blending with the steady slap of water against wood and steel. Robert Hale stood near the edge of the dock, shoulders squared inside his jacket, eyes fixed on the dark bulk of the old warehouse. Atlas stayed close at his side, not touching, not drifting, his presence deliberate and heavy with intent. This was no longer about guarding a house or holding a line. The dog's posture told Robert everything. Atlas was no longer reacting. He was choosing. Headlights cut through the darkness again, slower this time, more careful. Two vehicles rolled onto the pier and stopped short of the warehouse. Atlas's ears snapped forward at once, his body angling toward the sound, muscles tightening beneath his coat. Robert didn't need to look to know who had returned. Commander Ethan Cross stepped out first, tall and rigid, authority written into the way he occupied space. Behind him came the same men as before, the bearded SEAL with his broad frame and guarded eyes, the younger dark-haired SEAL whose doubts still sat close to the surface, and a fourth man Robert had not studied closely until now, tall and narrow, pale-faced, his movements sharp and uneasy, the kind of man who looked like he preferred plans over surprises. Cross stopped several yards away and spoke evenly. "Mr. Hale, you're standing in a restricted area." Robert didn't answer. Atlas took a single step forward and set his stance, shoulders squared, paws firm, eyes locked. Cross noticed and tightened his jaw. "That animal needs to be returned," he said. "Immediately." The younger SEAL shifted, his gaze flicking from Atlas to the warehouse and back again. "Sir," he said under his breath, "this is the same location." Cross ignored him. Atlas growled low, not loud enough to echo, but deep enough to be felt. Cross raised his voice, clean and sharp. "Atlas, stand down." The command was perfect, clear tone, proper structure. Years ago it would have worked without question. Atlas did not move. Robert felt the moment stretch, the instant when training gave way to judgment. Atlas had been shaped to obey voices like Cross's, but he had also been shaped to protect his handler and to recognize danger when it hid behind authority. "Atlas," Cross repeated, louder now. Nothing. The younger SEAL swallowed hard. "Sir," he said, "he's refusing." Atlas stepped fully in front of Robert, blocking Cross's line of sight, his body forming a barrier that needed no explanation. His posture was flawless, defensive hold at maximum coverage, minimal escalation. He was not reacting to sound, he was reacting to intent. Robert spoke softly, anchoring rather than commanding. "Stay." Atlas stayed. Cross's eyes flicked toward the warehouse. "You think you understand what he's reacting to," he said. "You don't." Atlas broke from the stance suddenly and moved, not toward the men, but toward the warehouse. He advanced at a controlled trot, stopped well short of the door, then turned back and barked once, sharp and precise. He lowered his head and paced a short arc, nose close to the ground, mapping an invisible line. Robert felt recognition crash into place. "He's marking," he said quietly. "Pattern, not territory." The younger SEAL stepped closer despite himself, eyes widening as Atlas sat abruptly and stared at the seam of the warehouse door. "That's not random," he murmured. "That's a hit." Cross snapped, "Enough!" Atlas barked again, louder, then snapped his head toward Cross and growled, deep and resonant. The bearded SEAL stiffened. "Sir," he said carefully, "that dog is indicating something specific." Cross's voice dropped. "You're all forgetting your place." Atlas moved again, circling wide, then stopping near a stack of old containers half hidden behind the warehouse. He sniffed once, then sat rigidly, refusing to move. Robert felt the memory lock into clarity. "That wasn't on the manifest," he said. "Not back then." Cross stared at Atlas, then at Robert, calculation flickering across his face. The younger SEAL took a step back. "Sir, if that's what I think it is—" Cross cut him off. "You will stand down." Atlas returned to Robert and placed himself in front of him again, eyes never leaving Cross, weight coiled, ready to prevent movement rather than attack. He had chosen his side. Robert felt pride surge, followed by grief. "You trained him well," Robert said to Cross. "Just not for this." Cross snapped back. "He's a tool, and he's malfunctioning." Atlas growled, steady and unblinking. The younger SEAL straightened, doubt hardening into resolve. "Sir," he said, "I can't ignore this. He's not acting out. He's exposing something." Cross turned on him. "You're relieved." The words landed heavy. Atlas tracked the exchange, then shifted his gaze briefly to the fourth man near the vehicles. The man's pale face tightened, sweat visible at his temple, despite the cold. His eyes darted to the warehouse and back. Atlas noticed and fixed on him, ears twitching. Robert noticed too. "That one's nervous," he said quietly. Atlas barked once in agreement. The man flinched. Cross stepped back a fraction, reassessing. Too many eyes, too many variables. One K9 who refused to forget. "This ends now," Cross said. "We're leaving." Atlas did not move. The harbor seemed to hold its breath. Cross looked at the dog, then at Robert, then at the warehouse behind them. Whatever plan he had arrived with was unraveling. "This isn't over," he said. "No," Robert replied. "It isn't." Cross turned sharply and signaled his team. The bearded SEAL followed without comment. The younger one hesitated, meeting Robert's eyes, something like apology passing between them, then turned away. The vehicles pulled back, engines fading into the night. Atlas stayed alert until the sound disappeared completely, then returned to Robert's side and sat, posture proud, breath steady. Robert knelt and rested his forehead briefly against the dog's. "You chose," he said softly. Atlas pressed his shoulder into Robert's chest. The truth stood clear now. Atlas had not disobeyed because he was broken. He had disobeyed because he recognized betrayal, and he had chosen to stand with the right person rather than the loudest command. The room was small, functional, stripped of anything unnecessary. Robert Hale sat straight-backed at the table, hands still, eyes forward. Atlas lay at his feet, body aligned with Robert's chair, alert but calm. No one had argued his presence. After the harbor, no one wanted to be the one who told the dog to leave. Across from Robert sat Captain Marcus Doyle, late 50s, broad-shouldered, gray hair cropped short, the kind of officer who had survived by choosing when to speak and when to listen. To Doyle's right was Laura Bennett, a Navy legal investigator in her early 40s, slim, sharp-eyed, dark hair pulled tight, her expression precise and unsentimental. A recorder hummed softly between them. "This statement is under oath," Doyle said. "I understand," Robert replied. "Start with the harbor," Bennett said. Robert did not hesitate. He spoke cleanly and directly. Atlas's alerts, the warehouse, the patterning, the containers not listed in any civilian or military manifest, the orders issued by Commander Ethan Cross, the attempt to force compliance, Atlas's refusal. He kept emotion out of it. Facts were enough. Bennett's pen moved quickly. "You're saying the dog acted correctly?" "Yes," Robert said. "Every time." "And you believe that behavior was deliberately misrepresented?" "Yes." The door opened. Commander Ethan Cross entered without asking permission. He looked composed, jacket immaculate, posture rigid. Control radiated from him, but it was thinner now. Behind him came 2 men from his unit, including the younger SEAL from the harbor. The younger man's face was tight, jaw set, eyes shadowed by fatigue and doubt. Cross sat. "This is unnecessary," he said. "The animal is compromised." Atlas lifted his head and fixed his gaze on Cross. No sound, no movement, just focus. Doyle's voice hardened. "You'll answer questions, Commander." Bennett slid a file across the table. "Let's talk about the warehouse. Containers routed through that location do not appear in any authorized logs." Cross did not touch the file. "I don't handle logistics." "No," Bennett said, "but your unit provided security." Silence tightened. The younger SEAL shifted. He was tall, lean, dark-haired, the look of someone trained to obey, but no longer willing to lie. "Sir," he said, voice controlled but strained, "we were told the warehouse was inactive." Cross shot him a warning look. "You weren't cleared for details," Doyle cut in. "You'll speak when asked." Bennett leaned forward. "We ran a sweep after last night. The materials stored there require authorization levels far above yours. Authorization that does not exist." A flicker crossed Cross's face. Gone as quickly as it appeared. Atlas stood, 1 step forward. He stopped beside Robert, body angled, eyes locked on Cross. The movement was precise, indicating, not threatening. The air in the room shifted. "He's reacting again," Bennett said quietly. "To you," Doyle added. Cross scoffed. "He's responding to stress." "He's detecting it," Robert said. The younger SEAL inhaled sharply and straightened. "Sir," he said, "during our last internal review, I flagged schedule discrepancies. Containers moved during blackout windows. I was told to drop it." Bennett's pen stopped. "By whom?" The younger man hesitated, then spoke. "Commander Cross." The door opened again. Security escorted in the 4th man from the pier. Nathan Cole, early 30s, thin build, pale skin, civilian logistics specialist. His eyes avoided Atlas completely. Sweat glistened along his hairline. "Mr. Cole," Bennett said calmly, "Atlas reacted strongly to you last night. Do you know why?" Cole swallowed. "I just followed orders." "Whose?" Doyle asked. Cole's eyes flicked to Cross. Atlas growled low. Cole flinched. "I didn't know what was in the containers," he blurted. "I was told it was cleared. I was told to falsify transit times, to keep quiet." Bennett closed the file. "Quiet enough to alter records and suppress reports." Cole nodded miserably. Cross stood abruptly. "This is a setup." Doyle rose with him. "Sit down, Commander." Atlas did not move, but his gaze tracked Cross precisely. No uncertainty, no hesitation. The statements followed quickly after that. Timelines were compared, logs cross-checked, inconsistencies collapsed. What had been labeled instability was reclassified as correct K-9 response. Independent handlers reviewed Atlas's behavior and confirmed it without qualification. Hours later, Bennett signed the final page. She looked at Robert. "The dog acted within training parameters?" "Fully." Robert nodded. "And you," she continued, "were removed when you wouldn't ignore what you saw." The words landed heavier than any accusation. Robert felt the past realign. He had not failed Atlas. He had been sidelined because he refused to look away. Doyle extended his hand. "Atlas is cleared," he said. "Completely." Robert shook it. Across the room, Cross was escorted out, authority reduced to procedure. Atlas watched him go, then sat at Robert's feet, calm and finished. Sarah Whitman stood near the wall, tall frame tense, dark eyes bright with restrained emotion. She crossed the room and touched Robert's arm briefly. "You were right," she said. Robert looked down at Atlas. The dog met his gaze, steady and certain. The truth had surfaced, not loudly, not dramatically, but permanently. Atlas was no longer accused. Robert was no longer doubting. What had been buried was now sworn to under oath, recorded, undeniable. Atlas lay down at Robert's feet, head on his paws, finally at ease. The paperwork took less time than Robert expected. No speeches, no ceremony, just signatures, dates, and the quiet finality of ink settling into place. Atlas sat beside Robert's chair, posture calm, eyes steady, as if he understood that this moment mattered more than any order ever had. Captain Marcus Doyle stood at the end of the table, broad frame relaxed for the first time since Robert had met him. He read the final line once more, then slid the document forward. "Atlas is officially retired," he said, "effective immediately, released from service, and transferred to civilian custody." He looked at Robert. "Yours." Robert nodded, the word landing deeper than he expected. "Thank you." Laura Bennett closed her folder and stood. Her sharp expression softened by a fraction. "He earned this," she said, glancing at Atlas. "So did you." She left without another word, efficiency intact, respect implied rather than stated. Sarah Whitman waited outside the building, leaning against her truck, tall and slim beneath her coat, dark hair loose now that the tension had drained away. Years ago the sea had taken her brother and left her wary of endings that came without warning. She watched Robert and Atlas step into the daylight and smiled, small but genuine. "So," she said, "what do two retired soldiers do next?" Robert looked down at Atlas. The German shepherd lifted his head, eyes clear, tail still, waiting. "We go home," Robert said. They did not linger in Harbor Bay. There was nothing left to prove and nothing left to fix. The town receded behind them as the road stretched out, gray and open. Atlas rode in the back, calm and alert, adjusting his weight with each turn, ears flicking at passing sounds. He was older now, the gray in his muzzle more visible in daylight, but the steadiness remained. Not vigilance born of threat, but awareness shaped by a lifetime of purpose. They stopped once, just outside town. Robert stepped out, breathing in the cold air, and Atlas joined him, standing shoulder to knee, close without crowding. The harbor wind carried distant gull cries and the faint smell of salt. Robert crouched and rested his hand on Atlas's neck. "That's it," he said quietly. "No more orders." Atlas leaned into the touch, just once, then stood tall again, not confused, not searching, content. The house sat at the edge of a quiet stretch of land, modest and weathered, waiting without expectation. Inside, sunlight cut across worn floors and bare walls. Atlas walked through slowly, not claiming space, simply learning it. He chose a spot near the window and lay down, head on paws, eyes half-lidded. Robert watched him and felt the years unwind, the weight of missions, the ache of unanswered questions, the guilt he had carried for believing he had lost his partner. All of it eased into something lighter. That night, Robert cooked a simple meal. Atlas waited patiently, then ate with quiet gratitude. No urgency, no tension. Later, when the house settled and the world outside grew still, Atlas rose and padded over to Robert's chair. He rested his head against Robert's knee and stayed there. No commands, no signals. Just presence. Robert smiled, the expression unfamiliar and real. He had walked away once, believing survival meant leaving everything behind. He understood now that survival sometimes meant returning, not to the fight, but to what had been worth fighting for. Atlas had chosen him when it mattered. Now the choice was mutual, final, and free. Morning would come without alarms. Days would pass without orders. Two old soldiers, bound by trust rather than duty, would move forward together, not into battle, into rest, into a life earned quietly, completely. Home was not a place marked on a map. It was the space between a man and a dog who had stood their ground when it mattered most. And at last they had arrived. At the end of this story, there is a quiet lesson that lingers long after the noise fades. Sometimes what looks like loyalty is actually faith in action. Sometimes what looks like instinct is a miracle working through a willing heart. Atlas did not just follow training. He followed truth. And Robert did not just find a dog. He was given back a brother when he needed one most. In life, God often sends answers in forms we do not expect. A companion who refuses to leave. A truth that refuses to stay buried. A second chance that arrives right when hope feels thin. This story reminds us that doing the right thing may cost us comfort, status, or approval. But it never costs us our soul. When we stand for truth even quietly, God stands with us. When we protect what is right, even when authority tells us to look away, we are never truly alone. Miracles are not always loud. Sometimes they look like loyalty that will not break, or courage that says no more. As you go back to your daily life, remember this. Be the person who holds the line. Be the one who chooses compassion over convenience, truth over fear, faith over silence. And if this story touched your heart, share it with someone who needs hope today. Leave a comment to tell us where you are watching from. Subscribe to the channel so more stories like this can reach hearts around the world. And if you believe, type Amen in the comments as a simple prayer. May God bless you, protect you, and remind you that even in a broken world, loyalty, truth, and love still matter.